Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra, and thanks to you and Nick for organising and hosting these sessions, and to the rest of you for coming along. Um, yeah, as Alexandra said, I'm planning to talk for probably about 45 minutes, and I have in mind 90 minutes together altogether. So I thought we breakouts if there are enough people to justify as a way to warm up the conversation, and do that for about 15 minutes and leave half an hour for open discussion, question and answer. But we can also feel once we've got to the end of my prepared talk, whether that makes sense. So I'm going to be talking about my deepening interest in exploring the edge between permaculture and shamanic practice. And I wanted to start just by explaining my relationship with the two topics, and how I've brought them together. And I In both cases, 1999 was a very crucial year for me in my relationship with both permaculture and shamanic practice. At the time, I was in the middle of PhD research on indigenous knowledge and the environmental management strategies of indigenous peoples in Guyana in South America, and had become impressed by the possibilities for economic and therefore social and cultural self-determination that came from the fact that my indigenous colleagues had access to land. They were in a situation regarding land tenure that's relatively favourable compared to a lot of other Amazonian peoples, plus still retain the body of skills and knowledge that allow them to make a living from that in a self-organized and autonomous basis. And I'd become fascinated by the idea of combining that degree of self-determination with access to the various benefits of the technological society from which I've come in intellectual, scientific, material fashion. When in 1999 I got together with a friend who just come back from Australia, and started raving about this wonderful thing called permaculture he'd come into contact with there, I gained the impression that there were already people who were exploring that type of combination with permaculture as a key methodology, and that led to an interest which over time has deepened in various ways through following the various training routes, and now committing to teaching and to training apprentices as a diploma tutor, which has led me to be here today in these talks. Around the same time, I had a profound healing crisis of chronic fatigue syndrome, and happened to receive a healing from a shamanic practitioner, a healing known as a soul retrieval, which transformed my relationship with that condition, took me from a path of decline into one of recovery, and shifted me from a an intellectual interest I already had in shamanism and and to a practical interest, following up my healing and consolidating and taking it further by learning to experience shamanic work through the shamanic journey, and developing a daily practice of shamanism as my core methodology for spiritual inquiry and for personal growth. Well, I deepened that through successive rounds of training, first of all as a practitioner in core shamanism, and later as a teacher of shamanism, which took me on the present route to combining the two, uh, through a personal practice that's about a daily deepening connection with the place, with the land where I live, with permaculture and shamanism as core methodologies for exploring that relationship and for integrating that into my relationship with myself. That practice and this inquiry, as I consider it, into what happens when you bring permaculture and shamanism together, is well informed by the academic background that I refer to, that resources me well intellectually in relation to it, and is feeding into my main current activity for the past 3 years now. I've been committed to the stewardship of a 1.5 hectare piece of land in central Portugal, which we're developing into an eco-social learning centre, which will also be a base for teaching in combination shamanism and permaculture, a training program I refer to as shamanic political ecology. I've over that time also been working on a book on permaculture and shamanism, which has been a long time in the making so far, but will be finished this year, and hopefully it's due for release by Permanent. I hope it's 2026, but I think they'll want to see a finished book before they commit on that front. And the key, what I'm going to talk through today, the content will be based on some of the key themes that have come up in the writing of that book. So I've been very much immersed in the detail of the writing. So it's a really nice opportunity for me to step back and to share with you some of the broad patterns that have arisen and that have begun to emerge from this inquiry in the writing of the book. Well, and just to mention them briefly, the order will go through them. The nature of both shamanism and permaculture as feral forms of academic inquiry, edge work, and the deepening edge that arises when we bring them together. And second, the common ground for that edge in terms of a shared preoccupation with revealing and engaging with the patterns in nature as manifestations of the sacred, which through our practice we can bring in to expression in experienced reality. Third, what happens when we consider design as ceremony and consider the parallels between permaculture design and shamanic ceremony. And then moving on to the parallels in fields related to the three core ethics of permaculture: earth care in relation to ecology, people care, and fair share. And then drawing some tentative conclusions from that, which I'll invite us to explore further in the discussion. So thinking about this relationship, the common origins or parallel origins rather of permaculture and shamanism, and most of you here probably know the story of Bill Mollison's experience of his disillusioned ecologist who was deep in the forest of Tasmania in deep and intimate connection with nature, and was taken by a vision of how nature's patterns can inform the design of our human systems, and of a design practice which would deliberately apply those patterns in how we organize human society and how we organize production or relationship with land, how we support human society, and to a design system that put that into practice, which became the foundation of permaculture. And there's a really nice short academic paper by professional ecologist and permaculturist Fiona Morris, who describes permaculture as a feral ecology. So when ecology breaks out uh, of the of the of the academy and becomes something different, becomes a practice and a movement for transformative social change and eco-social change. In parallel with that, shamanism is the notion of shamanism as a cross-cultural phenomenon was originally an analytical construct that came from, first of all, from ethnographers, initially Russian ethnographers who were working on the religious and mystical practices of Siberian indigenous peoples, and later anthropologists working in other parts of the world, from the universities and other institutions of other colonial powers, who identified common patterns among completely unrelated peoples all across the world, based on a belief in the existence of a spirit world, which has important agency, is part of the everyday world of people, and considered to be active in influencing human affairs. And alongside that, a set of specialized mystical practitioners and sets of institutions to support their work who are concerned with mediating the relationship between human society and this spirit world, this hidden world behind manifest reality. So shamanism is a common pattern identified by anthropologists to indicate this type of edge work. It's not an indigenous category in itself. Every different society that has shamanic institutions has its own sets of terms, sets of concepts for them. And what anthropology and anthropologists did was recognize that this is something which innumerable peoples independently across the world have discovered. Certain anthropologists went further and begun not only to train in shamanic practices, but to develop new forms of shamanism appropriate for their home cultures and their home societies. And particularly notable in this respect are Carlos Castaneda, who uh, he dazzled the psychedelic generation and then the post-psychedelic generation from the 1960s on, with a series of books that related his apprenticeship while a doctoral student in anthropology to a Mexican sorcerer shaman known as Don Juan. And although it turns out that Castaneda's fascinating books weren't factually true, there was no such person as Don Juan, and the experiences he wrote about were invented in the library of his university. But his series of books challenged the dominance of Enlightenment positivist thinking and made a statement as to the intense depth and relevance of non-Western ways of thinking, bodies of practice, and inspired a whole generation of people to take an interest in shamanic practice. And for me personally, my first opening of those doors was finding one of Castaneda's books at about the age of 16 on my parents' bookshelves and being blown away by the resonance with the world he described of his alleged experiences with Don Juan, and the fascinating world that I saw beyond the fringes of material reality and the mundane. And that, like many other people, was an important step in setting me on a path to a deep interest in shamanism. Michael Harner, a somewhat less controversial figure, did actually do his field work and in Amazonia with a group of people called the Jivaro, who eventually grew tired of him asking dull questions about their religion and persuaded him to try the sacred vine ayahuasca, which is the heart of their ritual and religious practices. And to cut a long story short, he was so blown away by the experience that he later, after his PhD, returned to Amazonia to train in as a shaman, and then conducted a cross-cultural study of shamanic practices all over the world, from which he abstracted core patterns in terms of the practices that are found in completely different people, different independently, and made them the basis of what's known as core shamanism, a content-free and culturally decontextualized form of shamanic practice, which accessible to Western people, or people who no longer have any contact with an ancestral shamanic tradition. So in both cases, these disciplines of ecology and anthropology, and we can consider them disciplines in a literal sense, in the sense that they were originally tools of colonial control to better understand and therefore manipulate and control nature, in the case of ecology, and people in the case of anthropology. And the translation, when permaculture went, ecology went feral as permaculture, when anthropology has gone feral as shamanism, they've become what I'd see as emancipatory practices, sets of tools and knowledge and of relationships that provide alternatives and provide routes to challenge the premises of a culture that's become increasingly toxic and increasingly dangerous, and giving us a whole new set of ideas and stories and narratives concerning our relationship with each other, with nature, and with the universe itself, and practices, tools with which to put them into practice, and what many academics refer to as relational ontologies, in the sense that just as ecology and its application in permaculture brings into our experience the fact that we are embedded in a web of life and learning to act in responsible fashion in relation to all of the other species and the ecological processes that we're part of. Shamanism and shamanic practice reveals to us that we're part of an equally fascinating and complex and important spiritual ecology. The practices of shamanism, and I don't think anybody can reliably explain why, but they reliably create an experience of relationship with a world of spirits within and beyond nature, and available to apply in a very practical sense to real world issues. So it's in relationship to these applications that the connection goes deeper. And Bill Mollison is he's often portrayed as quite hard-headed, scientific, and I think a lot of that comes from a over-enthusiastic, we might generously say, attempt to regulate the content of PDCs by trying very hard to exclude any content which he thought might lead permaculture to be become too closely associated with what he regarded as New Age woo, a legitimate concern, but which was probably over applied. But in terms of his actual vision and his inspiration, when we look at chapter 4 of the designer's manual, the chapter on patterns, there's a tremendous mystical vision expressed there when Mollison gives an account of the way patterns in nature reflect a more fundamental underlying order to reality that we can that he compares to the implicate order, the mystic's favorite interpretation of quantum physics by physicist David Bohm, who suggested that the apparent contradictions in quantum physics, the uh, complete contradictions between the world of everyday experience and the results that he and other physicists find when they go deep into the heart of the atom and deep into the heart of reality, can be explained if we consider the world of everyday experience and of material phenomena as just one manifestation of a deeply interconnected, what he referred to as an implicate order, which Mollison saw as expressed in the patterns in nature, and permaculture as a methodology for understanding and relating to those patterns in nature and expressing the learnings from that in our designs as a means to align ourselves more closely with the structure of that implicate order and more meaningfully relate ourselves to not just life, but the underlying creativity of the cosmos itself. Shamanic practice is another set of techniques that bring us into direct connection with these hidden patterns. So I've come to understand my own shamanic experience, and that described as others, as this entry into this world of spirits and apparently intelligent and purposeful entities as a representation for bringing the features of this implicate order, this underlying reality, into everyday experience, into direct experience in ways that allow us to work and create change at that underlying pattern level. And which, in various terms in the literature, Michael Harner referred to the shamanic state of consciousness. Castaneda referred to non-ordinary reality. Carl Jung, who's famous as a psychologist, but credibly regarded by many as the greatest 20th century Western shamanism. So about archetypes and the collective unconscious, all of which we can understand as equivalent to Bohm's implicate order and how it actually manifests in experience. And just to note how pioneers in permaculture who've been exploring that edge, particularly Alana Moore, a close contemporary and collaborator of Mollison in the early Australian permaculture scene, a permaculturist and geomancer who's written a series of books on a spirit-aware approach to permaculture. Starhawk, who in particular is a Wiccan practitioner, a magical practitioner whose book, The Earth Path, in particular, integrates this type of spiritual practice with permaculture and with social change work, which is also the basis of her earth activist training. More recently, there are shamanistic elements in Luby McNamara's cultural emergence that combines permaculture with Joanna Macy's work that reconnects and the Eight Shields of John Young, which is derived from his experience with indigenous teachers and includes a lot of the ritual elements of shamanic practice, if not the direct encounters with the spirit world, which I'd consider as diagnostic of as shamanism itself. In practice, then this comes together when we consider the common ground between the design process in permaculture and shamanic ceremony, both of which seek to engage in structured and purposeful ways with the the patterns underlying reality as through deep and sustained observation of nature, in the case of permaculture, and through ritual practices which bring us into dialogue with the spirit world, in the case of shamanism. And to harvest learning from that, to apply those insights to particular effect in the material world in ways that are always concerned in some way with reconfiguring social and ecological relationships. And these reconfigurations, this application of pattern level understanding, allows us to realize design outcomes that weren't attainable from the way of thinking that we had before we undertook the design process or the shamanic ceremony. And we can draw parallels in between in the setting of a design brief. When you start out on a permaculture project, you set a set of goals, and before you conduct a shamanic journey or of an equivalent form of ceremony, you set a clear intention, a question or a goal or a request that's the desired outcome of the experience. The journey itself, the experience of the spirit world, is equivalent to the observation, and is always followed by a certain interpretation. Well, how do I make sense of that experience? How does that apply to the question or request I had? And how does that interpret how I act upon that? What decisions can I reach that equivalent to the design decisions that we reach, and which in both cases form the basis of a course of action. There's no point in doing either without actually putting the results into practice. And both are in or reflect the deeper meta pattern of the action learning cycle, probably familiar to most of us here in relation to permaculture, for which Starhawk in her work has created a really evocative metaphor, the spiral dance underlying creation, spirals of opening up to a broader understanding of reality than that which leads us to encounter a certain problem or issue we can't resolve, and integrating the findings of that experience into a round of action which allows us to, which opens further possibilities, which form the basis for our way of being and our continued engagement with the world. And I just want to mention that this was very much inspired, this understanding, by a wonderful book by Sean Wilson, an indigenous researcher who, and his book Design is Ceremony, which describes research is ceremony, which describes academic research processes as a form of relational reconfiguration, similar to both shamanic ceremony and permaculture design. When we consider applications in earth care, a powerful reference point for me is a huge body of literature in environmental anthropology and ecological anthropology on the resource management strategies of indigenous and traditional peoples who have somehow resolved complex management issues regarding social and ecological circumstances in which they live, and the fact of inhabiting inherently unpredictable ecological consequences. And the common finding that these inevitably combine rational and non-rational ways of knowing. Like all indigenous knowledge systems have a huge part that's compatible with rational hypothetico-deductive science, with analytical inquiry, the documentation of the mundane ecological phenomena around them. plus a whole set of beliefs, practices, uh, and ways of understanding and making decisions about nature, in which shamans and shamanic institutions play a central role. And there's some classic studies, such as those of Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov, who was working with Tucano people in the Upper Amazon, who described a view of a constant circulation of energy through the human, the natural, and the spirit worlds, mediated by shamans, which form a form of what he considered indigenous ecological analysis that informs the ways people hunt, the ways people farm, the ways people relate to nature in ways that have important ecological regulatory functions that are crucial to the sustainability of the social ecological system and the continued viability of the resource base in terms of being productive for human needs. Similar studies in New Guinea by Roy Rappaport showed the ways that shamanic ceremonies, rituals undertaken in ongoing cycles constantly serve to redistribute the allocation of labor and land to agricultural production, to raising livestock, and the distribution of territories of different villages across the landscape in ways which again regulate the ecological conditions and the agroecological conditions, and which require very much on ritual practice as a form of collective knowing, of sensing the state of the social ecological system, and making decisions about warfare, about territorial boundaries that affect and reorganize these. And in all cases, they're involved with particularly navigating in this diagram at the top right, this what's called the back loop of ecological and social ecological cycles. So in contrast to this, the model from 20th century ecology, where ecological systems were considered to grow to a more or less stable climax and where disturbance was considered an anomaly, a recognition that regular events of breakdown of release and reorganization and learning of the system are inherent to any complex system, any ecological system, and any social ecological system inhabited by people. And shamanic and ritual practices have crucial roles, particularly in how people navigate this phase of reorganization when the system's in a particularly critical and sensitive state, and where the possibilities for both social and ecological learning are maximized. And this has been described as by Fikret Berkes, an ecologist who became interested in indigenous ecologies when he realized they were much more effective than the scientific ecology in which he trained, and he was working in solving complex social ecological issues as a fuzzy logic approach in terms of grasping the broad parameters of the system in order to make informed decisions that orient that decision, or orient the trajectory of the system in appropriate ways. So pattern level understanding again. And shamanic practices applied in the context of permaculture don't, in the absence of the institutions that allow these regulatory mechanisms, they allow us to bring into direct experience expressions of ecological phenomena. and to bring ourselves into dialogue with them and to invite them in as participants in our own design processes. So to that, for design to become more fully a process of participation, of co-creation with nature, through the deeper opportunities for observation and dialogue, which shamanic practice allows. Okay, hopefully I've got my cough under control now. To keep on.
Please, Tom, feel free to take a second, no worries.
That's okay, and it seems very poignant that this coughing fit has arisen just as I got to the point of people care, considering shamanic healing approaches, which, whether in indigenous contexts or in the context of neo-shamanic practice, take a systemic view which sees the person as a complex, multi-level phenomenon. Body, mind, soul, spirit, embedded in these webs of social and ecological relationships. There's no such thing in shamanic healing of a purely individual healing. It's always related to social healing. Social healing is always related to ecological healing. And it's a holistic approach that's very similar to what Gabor Mate has referred to as a biopsychosocial paradigm that sees individual illness as a reflection of the psychological impacts of social conditions, with an added ecological component, which is currently missing from Mate's analysis, but also very present in disciplines like eco-psychology, which are very much about the healing of our material, psychological, and cultural estrangement from nature. Uh, and one point that was on the last slide, which I didn't speak about at the time, was the effect of applying shamanic practice in our relationship with nature. The instantaneous effect described by in various books by Stephen Harold Booner as a form of perception called bionosis, where there's a form of mutual entrainment between our nervous systems and the consciousness of other beings, and in fact, the ecosystem we're part of, which leads to a direct shared perception, uh, a non-intellectualized way of direct knowing and direct understanding, of being able to perceive nature and other living beings through and within ourselves, and to perceive ourselves as part of nature. And many shamanic practices for nature connection provide an experience of that, and the cumulative effect of applying these practices repeatedly over time is to embed to bionosis as an everyday form of perception, to actually live in a constant awareness of our being part of the natural systems around us. And shamanic healing approaches, particularly those that have been adopted by core shamanism, allow us to deepen that process to become more fully ecological, more fully participatory, and to follow shamanic biographies that always begin with a healing crisis. I mentioned my own healing crisis for chronic fatigue, and the biographies of indigenous shamanism. There was always a life-threatening illness that isolates the person from the social world, and through a healing process reorganizes them, recreates them as a shaman in indigenous societies that have the institutions to recognize and support this, and which core shamanism has various techniques to navigate, all of which rely on this systemic view and the reorientation, the putting into appropriate relationships of aspects of the person, the internal systemic relationships and external relationships with the spirit world in ways that are life enhancing, life inducing, and enable us more fully to come into right relationship in terms of mutual enlivening relationship with other people, with our social world, and with nature in our ecological world. And that applies to the individual in personal biographies and at community levels. So a community that's healing its relationship with nature, and in which individuals are becoming healed in our relationships with nature, can partake in these processes of mutual healing, the mutual enrichment of nature and society, which is what permaculture is all about. And just briefly, as we're getting close to time, again, this shamanic biography is all about navigating cycles of death and rebirth, including the ultimate transition of birth, where a set of practices known as psychopomp are concerned with the passage of consciousness from life into death and whatever happens after death. Again, the reconfiguration of relationships and an antidote towards a cultural outlook, which many authors, particularly Tim Jackson, who an important post-growth scholar I'm thinking of here, has described as a death denial project, rather than natural cycles of decline and decay and death that we experience in nature, in the adaptive cycle, as I showed a couple of slides ago, and those cycles in life with the natural closure of cycles in life and the finality, the notion of constant economic growth, of linear processes with either a definite end goal or with and an absence, an aversion to death, disease, to breakdown, and which permaculture as a form of eco-social design is in my view, direct political opposition, in that the basic premise of permaculture for people to take responsibility for our own relationship, our own impacts on the ecological and the social world are incompatible with the premises of capitalism. And whenever permaculture panders to capitalism and seeks to work within the system, it's, to me, to some sense, limiting that political angle, which is inherent and I believe benefits from being overt, and whose application would make what post-colonial scholar Arturo Escobar refers to as political ontologies, which are the set of alternative worldviews which underline self-organized commons and other forms of non-capitalist activity worldwide, in which the marriage of shamanism and permaculture, and shamanism as a complementary relational belief system, and the history of association of shamanism with both internal challenges within societies to authority structures such as patriarchy, and with political resistance whenever indigenous and traditional societies have encountered the colonization in the colonial era and now through economic colonization at the frontier. Shamans have always been important cultural intermediators and sources of political resistance. And there's a great attention in the political struggles of indigenous societies to retaining freedom of belief, freedom of expression, and freedom of spiritual practices. And in a great integration of this, then Starhawk has characterized magical practice as a form of liberation psychology that can help us overcome the internalization of these toxic cultural values. There's a great and important and growing trend in permaculture for decolonization, which to me has three main strands. One, the disinvestment from the material structures of extraction, of exploitation, of impression. Second, the creation of alternatives that can allow us to reduce our material dependence on capitalism. And this third, what Starhawks refer to as a liberation psychology of deconstructing the psychological and cultural structures which keep us in our way of being, in our way of thinking, dependent of and complicit in this death denial project. And this inquiry that I'm undertaking is finding a powerful resonance between shamanism as an everyday practice of the sacred and permaculture as a form of political action, of constructive practical politics, which come together in what I refer to as a sacred political ecology that I'm exploring through my practice, and which I invite anybody who's interested, who feels to connect with me through any of these ways, in any of these means. So,
Thank you,
what
Tom.
I have to say for now. Over to you, and Alexandra.
Um, will it be possible to keep the last slide a little longer so people can take notes or maybe a photo? They want to connect with you. Thank you so much. Um, thank you for this.
Summarizes while it's there as much. In relation to the book, I'm going to be looking for case studies of people who are applying shamanic practice in their own work on permaculture, which everybody does it in different ways, and people with an interest in the topics to read draft chapters and potentially give feedback. I'm running an online course later this year to go deeper into the practice of the permaculture and shamanism, and beginning a series of in-person trainings from my base in Portugal, as well as integrated shamanic work into training for diploma apprentices. And there's a variety of ways to track me down if you're interested in following any of them.
Thank you, Tom. Um, shall we go in the breakout rooms? Or yeah, is everyone happy to try?
We set it for 10 minutes, Alexandra, and just to have a chance to process and bring up any of the key themes that have come up in there, and then we can share more fully. Yeah.
Okay, we are nine, so I think we will be two, 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 and three. And I see you in Sorry, 1 second. I can do this. Dominic, shall we interrupt the recording or we
Yes.
keep it? Yeah.
Yeah, I stopped recording.